So I'm an artist and educator, and I work with K through 8 right now, kids. That's one of the things I do, but then I also do a lot of sculptural work. I do a lot of illustration work, and those things have been in gallery shows, museums. I've worked with places to do residencies with kids as well. So lots of different things, lots of different pieces all are part of my life as an artist. So when I'm starting these small sculptures, I have to pick the clay that I want to work with. It has to be a clay that I can use hand building techniques with. And so different clays have different needs. If I'm working with something like a porcelain is really finicky. It doesn't like you to move it one way and then change your mind and move it a different way. It also requires you to dry it much more slowly. And so as I'm building something out of porcelain, I have to be really cognizant of how wet the clay is, how fast it's drying, how I'm connecting those pieces together. And the wear rate is higher, the wear rate failure is higher. So pieces are more likely to break, pieces are more likely to crack. Even if they looked fine in the building of it, they can crack in the firings. So it's a little bit more challenging. I also use kinds of clay, like I use a chocolate clay, and I use another sculptural clay. It's called trail mix, both of which sound delicious. And I just use a lot of hand building techniques with those as well. So things like rolling out little balls, or rolling out coils, or creating slabs to start building these different pieces. And then smoothing those pieces together. Again, being really careful to make sure that the wet and dry ratio, that they're drying out nice and evenly so that they're not going to crack, and making a lot of choices as I go. So each piece I make is completely unique. So I'm not creating a mold for these particular pieces. Each one is individual and sculpted by hand. Ago, I was really super seriously into my business. I was doing tons of residencies and tons of art shows, and was feeling a lot of pressure that everything I made needed to be serious artistic content. And it was really taking a lot of the joy out of art for me. And for me, that's a really important piece of creating. And I decided I needed to stop taking myself so seriously and have fun and be a little goofy. And I started making this series of butts, because butts kind of make me giggle in a like middle school sort of way. And as I started making these butts, people loved them. People responded so well to them. I made so many friends at parties because people would say, "Oh, what do you do?" And I would say, "I'm an artist." And they would say, "What are you making?" I would say, "Well, right now I'm making a lot of butts." And it was great. And then from there, I started also making the boobs, which also people just giggle at, which is great. It's great to make grown-ups laugh. And at places like art shows, people will come up and they'll see the butts and the boobs, and they'll kind of stop, and then they'll kind of look a little closely, and they'll say, am I seeing this right? This is a butt. And it's hilarious and it's great. And I regularly sell out of them, which is kind of a fun thing too. They've been one of my like best-selling sculptural pieces. And it's this thing that I made because I needed to laugh, and I needed to have fun, and I needed to stop being serious all the time. As I'm building, it is a very organic process, and the shapes are very organic. The kinds of things that I'm inspired by are also organic shapes. They're things from nature, and so they don't have to be perfect in a straight edge architectural way, but our brains are trained to look for imperfections, and our brains are trained, especially with human features, to recognize when something isn't right. So as I'm building, I'm just making little tiny changes until things feel right or feel organic to me, feel smooth to me, which is tricky since each piece is totally unique. I'm trying to make sure that they feel like themselves, which probably doesn't make any sense, but that things feel like they go together, things feel like they are from nature, they are from either a bird or a human. They've got the right textures, which is strange to think about, like what the textures of skin are, and how skin is often smooth, but it's not perfectly smooth. Humans have, dimples and dents and creases. And so I'm just kind of looking to see when it feels right, when it looks the most authentically like a human or a piece of anatomy, or has the spirit of whatever I'm looking for. So it's pretty nebulous. I grew up going to the Oregon coast with my family as a child, and was really fascinated by all of the natural things, fascinated by the tide pools, and especially the starfish there. And there used to be so many starfish here. And around 2013, there was a disease basically that wiped out tons of starfish. And so they're much rarer now. You can still find them in the tide pools, but they're much rarer. And I keep thinking back to them. And so that sort of started this sculptural project that I'm working on with the starfish, that I make out of primarily dark sort of chocolate clay, but sometimes I'm using other clays as well, and creating all sorts of different textures on those and different colors, just like starfish in the natural world would have. And I'm also super fascinated. I've got really great big windows here at my studio, and the birds fly past, and I can see the river from here. And as the birds, many of them leave for the winter, I miss them. I miss seeing them sort of swoop across. I miss seeing them building their nests and calling to each other. And so I started building these birds. And I've actually been building these birds even since before Astoria was my home base. I've been building these birds since I was in college, and really looking at what the abstracted form of a bird is. What does a bird need to have in order for you to recognize it as a bird and have it have that spirit of a bird? When I'm choosing color, I'm thinking about two completely different things. I have a bit of duality in myself in that I really love sort of smooth, cool colors, but I also love like crazy rainbow colors. So my work tends to waffle back and forth between those two. A lot of my work is really sort of pristine and crisp and white. I use a lot of white porcelain. I use a lot of crackled glaze or crawling glaze, which means that the glaze sort of splits apart from itself and makes a really interesting texture. So often my pieces are white or white and black, but then I sort of go the opposite direction sometimes and end up with really being fascinated by pieces that have lots of color, that are rainbow effects or stained glass effects. As I've shifted more to working with the chocolate clay, which I really love because it has that rich, dark tone to it. I have experimented some more with the glazes that will work with that clay. And the colors that work for that clay are really different than the colors that work when you're working with the porcelain. The porcelain is really white, it's bright, you can get really bright colors on there, or that really crisp white, and it's really clear. But when you're working with the dark chocolate clay, the clay itself is interacting more with the glaze. And so as you're adding the glaze to it, the glaze is affected by the dark clay and the minerals in the dark clay. And so I'm really fascinated by glazes that aren't perfectly flat or smooth or even in their coloring. When I'm working with the chocolate clay, I like glazes that have a little bit of that organic feel themselves. That's really different from someone who maybe makes more functional ware that you eat out of. I really like when glazes split apart from themselves. I really like when glazes cool and create sort of crystalline looks as well. I love colors like teal. I love colors like purple. I love colors that have sort of earth tones in them, but have a little bit of variation, which is much more organic, much more like the natural forms that I'm most of the time portraying in my small sculptures. So when I'm making, or when I'm glazing the starfish, there's a couple things that I need to keep in mind. One is that the glaze needs to be an even coat, needs to be a thick coat. Often it needs to be 2 or 3 coats, depending on the kind of glaze that I'm using and depending on the thickness of the glaze. And I need to make sure that it's not dripping down onto the bottom of the piece, because the glaze, when it goes in the kiln, melts. And the silica, the glass that's in glaze, will melt, it'll pool on the shelf of the kiln, and then it solidifies when it cools. And so it's hard, it gets stuck to the kiln. So we don't want that, no sticking to the kiln. And so I'm using usually a brush that can hold a lot of water, a lot of ink, or a lot of glaze in this case, and using that to cover everything evenly. In the past, I've sometimes had access to wax, and I like to wax the bottoms of the pieces. The wax keeps the glaze from melting down. I don't have that in my current studio setup, which is too bad, which means there's also a lot of cleanup. If I do get any drips or blobs on the bottom of the pieces, anything gets away from me, I need to wipe that with a sponge really thoroughly so it's not on the bottom or in sort of an area that it could start to drip down. So that's a little bit tricky. And then I'm making sure that I'm making the glaze the right consistency too. So different glazes need to be sort of different thicknesses in order to work optimally. So some glazes, like my crawling glazes, the ones that sort of split apart from themselves, they need to be a little thicker when I'm applying them in order to spread the way that I like. Whereas some of the glazes that need to pool need to be able to soak into the cracks, need to be able to soak into the texture of the starfish in particular. So when I started making these mini sculptures, I was thinking about how people would be displaying them. Usually in galleries, there's a lot of wall space, but there's not a whole lot of space for sculptural freestanding pieces. So I knew I wanted to create some pieces that you could hang on a wall really, really simply. And so most of the small sculptures have a little hole in the back of them that would fit most small-headed nails. So you could fit a nail right into this little hole in the back. And when I'm sculpting the pieces, I have to make that hole then. It's much better than trying to drill into the clay later. And so when I'm pressing that hole, I'm trying to make sure that it's going to be big enough to sit on a small-headed nail. It's going to be secure enough, and it's also going to hold something in a way that it hangs nicely. So I don't want to put the hole in the wrong spot and have everything sort of like lilt sideways. So there's more thought really in that part than people might realize. And those pieces can be displayed by themselves or in groups, and they can just go into like a regular wall, no problem. They're not so heavy that they need any kind of special hardware. So when I'm making the birds, it's a much more complicated process. They have 3 different materials involved. So it's the ceramic, it's the wire, and it's the wood. So we have to drill into the wood and sculpt with the wire pieces. And then in the clay, I have to make those holes before they are fired. So there's a lot of forethought in there, and there's a lot of trying to get the wire pieces, which are the legs, to look sort of organic, but it's from this really hard material. So none of these materials are soft. Wood is a hard material, though it is a natural material, and metal as well, and that clay. And so having something that has sort of a softness to it, but is made out of these hard, durable materials is a little bit of a trick, a little bit of an adventure. So the legs, they're not perfect representations of legs in that they don't need to have, all of the joints and the toes and the details. I'm going for more of the inspiration, the spirit of a bird, more of the movement of a bird, rather than making something that is photorealistic. And so once all of those pieces are made, those individual legs, so it's not, the legs aren't all exactly the same either, in the same way that the wood is not all exactly the same, and the clay is not all exactly the same. They're all each individual pieces. And then they are put together, glued together, to create these more organic spirit of birds. I hope that as people interact with my small sculptures and as they have them in their homes or wherever they are, that they are able to get some peace, if peace is what they need, or they're able to get like a giggle if that's what they need, or they're able to remind themselves of the fact that things aren't perfect and that's okay, of the fact that nature is fleeting and durable and fragile all at the same time. I hope that people are able to feel some peace and relaxation as they interact with the pieces, and really find whatever they need to find and make the connections that they need to make in their own lives.